my pleasure to introduce you to Dahlia Lithwick.
Melissa, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I want to thank everyone at Sidley who has really patiently waited out, rescheduled and replanned and been really nimble. I desperately wish I could be with you in person. I really could use a whole bunch of women lawyers to grieve with right now, but I thought, with your permission, I'm slightly going to repurpose my remarks, and then Melissa and I are going to leave 15 minutes at the end for your questions, so I hope you have lots of them, and you should put them in the chat. But I thought, instead of talking about how women transformed the Supreme Court, maybe with your kind permission, we could reconfigure things a bit and just talk about Justice Ginsburg and how she reconfigured the court and the law, and how she changed everything for so many of us. And then you can have me back next year and I'll talk about the other women justices. But I want to really highlight what Melissa just said, because I've been really stuck all week, including just now taping Trevor Noah, on the horns of what I think is just a fundamental misunderstanding of Justice Ginsburg. And while I am the first person to celebrate the, iconic rapper, notorious, badass, fierce feminist that is on all my mugs, all my earrings, all my scarves, I could go on. I also think that we misapprehend what she really truly was and how she effected change. And I guess I just felt like if I was going to be at a virtual wake for one of my heroes, I wanted to do it with a bunch of women who understood that what RBG did was both utterly radical and also just the everyday job of being a woman lawyer. And that celebrating those latter qualities, the qualities that Melissa just referenced of good faith and empathy and persuasion and forming alliances across lines. Those are things that attorneys do every day. And I want to be angry, and there will be place for anger, but Justice Ginsburg was not angry. She went through her entire life seemingly swallowing down, choking back fury so that she could be effective. And again, I think there is a place for anger in the law, but I really want to celebrate her as a lawyer's lawyer, as somebody who put process and who put methodology and brilliance ahead of that. So I realize I am something akin right now to, you remember when Key and Peele did the Obama anger translator? I think I'm going to try to do some version of the Key and Peele Ruth Bader Ginsburg not anger translator, and to try to, with your permission, dismantle a little bit some of the ideas about how she got things done. So I want to start just with two personal stories, and one really was, Melissa referenced it, that a couple of years ago, before I'd even met her, Justice Ginsburg told Jess Braven that she read me because I was quote unquote spicy. And I think in Ginsburg talk, what that means is that I was irreverent and tried to cover the court as theater and tried to cover it as something that was alive and breathing and human. And I was surprised at the time because of all the justices, she is the most poker-faced. She is the one who seemed, I think, most humorless. There's a famous story that her daughter tells that some of you have heard about how they used to have a little jar when they were growing up called Mommy Laughed, and they'd put like a little coin in it whenever she laughed, and it was like empty, because I think her husband Marty was the comedian and Justice Ginsburg was very, very serious. And so I was taken aback at the time that she liked to have somebody poking fun at the court, somebody slightly taking it down a peg and humanizing it. And that's, I think, one of the paradoxes of RBG. I think that even though she presented as incredibly grave and serious, she had a wicked, wicked sense for other people's humor. And one of the things she loved best about Marty, her husband, was that he cracked her up constantly. And when I asked her once how it was that she and Justice Scalia managed to get on so well despite profound differences, she said, he made me laugh. He just is hilarious. And for her, that forgave a multitude of sins. The other personal story I want to tell is that I interviewed her. I was unbelievably fortunate. Right before COVID closed the court, I got to sit down with her for an hour last January. And we had done a series at Slate called The Class of RBG. I can put it up in the chat for folks who haven't seen it, where we tried to track down all 9 of the women who entered Harvard with her and speak to all of them, mostly about that famous scene with Dean Griswold, the one that's captured in all the movies and the stories, where he makes each of the 9 women in this class of 500-some men stand up and explain to him why they're taking the place of a man at the Harvard Law School. And we just were curious what they all said, because in the movie, Ginsburg mumbles something about wanting to support her husband's legal career, and he was at Harvard. We wondered what the other women said. And we spoke to all of the women that were still alive. And we, very Ginsburgishly, by the way, we sent all of our notes over to her before she sat down for the final interview of the project. And she found out immediately that we'd missed somebody, because one of the women, Trudy, had not graduated, so she wasn't in the yearbook. And she sent back a note, extensive notes, as she was wont to do, saying, "You must find Trudy," which we finally tracked Trudy down. By the way, we called her, and she was shouting at us because at 87, she was very busy that day running the New Hampshire primary and didn't have time to gossip with us. But we did track down all the women, and one of the things that was really notable, among many, many things in the series, is that she was very candid with us, that she wasn't the smartest girl in her class. She mentioned that another person in her class was actually far smarter and would have gone far. And I tell you this because I think that, again, she loved the iconography. She loved the hagiography. She loved that everybody, as she said, I'm 80 years old and everyone wants to take a picture with me. But I think she really deeply believed she was just lucky. And she deeply believed, I think, that if any one of those women had married a Marty and had a real champion and supporter at their side, that they would have been elevated to the U.S. Supreme Court and not her. And the final piece of that story is that if you listen to the audio of that last interview I got with her, and it's an hour, and it is amazing that she remembers everything photographically. But at the middle part, I said something about how one of the women we had talked to, that her family had related to us, she was dead, that when she first heard that Justice Ginsburg was being nominated by Bill Clinton, she burst into tears. She was just jealous and disconsolate. And I asked Justice Ginsburg, what did that make you feel like when you heard about that? And she just deadpan said, I don't really have time for emotions, like Mr. Spock on Star Trek. And again, it seemed to me as though this was a human being had constructed herself out of just a poker face and a brain and the charging forward and never, ever taking time to be sad or angry or jealous or to have regrets. One of the things I really noticed when I saw the film, the biopic about her on the basis of sex, is how often she seemed angry in the film, angry at Marty, angry at the men at the ACLU project, angry at the folks who mooted her for her first oral argument at the 10th Circuit, very angry at her daughter Jane. And I thought to myself, maybe she just led this double life where she was angry all the time in person and then completely composed in public life. But I think that's also wrong. I think that she just managed to get through, right or wrong, by going on these 2 pieces of advice that her mother gave her as a child. And the 2 pieces of advice, she cites them every time she tells her story, is 1, be a lady, and 2, be independent. And be a lady in her construction, right or wrong, meant don't waste your time with feelings. Don't have strong emotions. And rightly or wrongly, that is the way she chose to live most of her life. The other thing that I really noticed about Justice Ginsburg is that she didn't have time for anger because she described her own progress, at least at the ACLU, when she talked about what she was doing at the Women's Rights Project. She described it, she likened it to being a kindergarten teacher. She said her job was to talk to these panels of all white men and to explain to them again and again, patiently, why gender discrimination built into the law disadvantaged men as well as women. That's what she did. And I remember at the time thinking, dear God, the most powerful woman, the iconic, emblematic, powerful woman of America thinks that her job was to be a kindergarten teacher, and how just deeply, deeply disempowering that really was, until I realized it's a big, big part of what lawyers do. We have to be kindergarten teachers. We have to patiently explain and explain again, sometimes patently obvious truths. And that is not disempowering. It's, in fact, a form of superpower. And that what she did when she would say to men, okay, maybe you don't get it. You know, she used to say, you're putting us on a pedestal. You think it's a pedestal, but in fact, it is a cage. That in order to make that point, she couldn't even say that the law, as gendered as it was, disadvantaged women. She had to bring case after case after case to prove that it disadvantaged men. And I think that that's really one of the things, as I've been reflecting on RBG's legacy this week, one of the things I wanted to share with you is that it seems to me that she didn't have a zero-sum idea about the law and power. She wasn't saying women are better, women should have everything, men should have nothing. It was such an expansive view of equal protection in her mind that she really believed that if women and men were equal, not only would women have more opportunities, but that men could live fuller, more capacious lives. And I love that about her, because it's not any kind of standard fierce feminism to say, I want men to be fully realized emotional creatures. And if they want to stay home and be a caregiver for their ailing mother, men should be allowed to do that. And I think that also is a profoundly radical, but actually profoundly lawyerly way of looking at the world. I'm going to construct this argument in a way that nobody loses. Everybody gets to be a slightly more complete person. And I think that that is another thing she just doesn't get enough credit for when we craft this mythology around her of the fire-breathing dragon. So the very last thing I want to say on this point about how I think we misunderstand her is that one of my favorite quotes that doesn't make it onto the mugs and the T-shirts and the tote bags, but it is something that she emphatically believed, is this, quote, fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. And I think what she was really saying is that you have to model, you have to live it and walk it and be the kind of person that other folks want to join, even if it means sucking it up and reading a blistering dissent from Antonin Scalia that questions your abilities or your intelligence, even if it means time and time again having to woo Anthony Kennedy back to the fold on reproductive rights cases. And again, I think it's not any kind of classic male notion of power, but it is both a woman, I think, and a lawyerly view of the world that says, not the cliche that you catch more, flies with honey, but simply that you have to model being a decent, civil person, and people will want to follow along, and that you can call it a kindergarten teacher or you can call it caving, but that was how she lived her life. I think we often forget, and I think this is important for this audience, how profoundly conservative, small c, Ruth Bader Ginsburg really was. We think of her as a rabid, bra-burning feminist, but she was anything but. And in fact, it was her students that were burning their bras. She was too old for that first wave of women's lib. And by the time she was tapped by Bill Clinton to be on the U.S. Supreme Court, the women's rights movement had moved on and really, truly did not want her to be on the Supreme Court. It is amazing in retrospect how history has forgotten how much the women's group wanted no part of her nomination. And that was for two reasons that I think are also pretty prescient. One was they felt that she was all the things I've just described: middle class, small bore, incremental, way too cautious and protective of men's sensibilities. None of that was working for the women's rights movement in the 1990s. They thought she was so old-fashioned and so past her sell-by date that there was nothing that she could teach women about lawyering. But the other thing I think is important, the other reason they did not want her on the Supreme Court was because she was critical of Roe. And she was critical of Roe for ways that have proven absolutely prescient in our time. She felt that Roe, first of all, bit off more than it could chew, and that it would cause a backlash, which it did. But more urgently, she felt that Roe mistakenly located reproductive freedom in the privacy, the penumbras of the Due Process Clause, and not in the Equal Protection Clause where she felt it belonged. And she always was plain about the fact that this has nothing to do with a sacrosanct relationship between a woman and her physician. This had everything to do with a woman's ability to function as an equal in a society if she couldn't make fundamental choices about her body and her work life. And in hindsight, I think she was kind of right about that. It's a much more solidly rooted and persuasive view of Roe. And in all the ways that I think Roe is under attack now, I think that in some ways she was really prophetic when she said, this is not the fertile ground we want to plant reproductive freedom in. But at the time, that meant that she was seen as being critical of Roe. And a lot of the women's rights groups thought she wouldn't support it. So I think she showed us all, right? Stipulated. She becomes an icon. She goes on to have this third act after these very conservative, Act One, you know, the kindergarten teacher lawyer just taking baby steps, trying to prove to men that women aren't scary. Act Two on the DC Circuit, where she votes in alignment with Judge Bork and Judge Scalia more than anyone else on the court, and just does a lot of pretty narrow, technical, small ball. Her writing at the time was very, very much reliant on quoting others and not being showy. And then she gets onto the Supreme Court and something changes. And this is the topic of my speech. Did she just get angry? Did she just finally lose it in the last 15 years and give up on all of the values, the lawyerly values that I've been celebrating here, and just become a crazy attack dog? Well, I think the answer to that is no. When Jeff Rosen asked her at one point whether she changed at some point in the mid-2000s on the Supreme Court, when she started writing Hobby Lobby and Walmart and Lilly Ledbetter and the Shelby County dissent. And she said, I didn't change at all. The court just changed around me. And I think one of the things that she was referencing, and it's useful because I think you can't talk about women in the law without talking about allyship. But one of the things that really fundamentally changed her was when Sandra Day O'Connor left the bench. And you all probably know the story, but I love it, which is that at every single oral argument that the two of them sat together, some oral advocate, once or twice the Solicitor General, called Sandra Ruth and called Ruth Sandra. It happened every term that somebody called O'Connor Justice Ginsburg and called Justice Ginsburg Justice O'Connor, so much so that the National Women's Law Center had T-shirts made for them that said, "I'm Sandra, she's Ruth. I'm Ruth, she's Sandra," in the hopes that like maybe we could stop confusing them. But even though I think it was ridiculous that lawyers confused them for the entire time they sat together, they were such allies and supports to one another. And we're so welcoming, I think, of each other as women. And even though all of the studies subsequently have shown that they disagreed, as you would expect from a Republican appointee and a Democrat, they disagreed about half the time on the merits. On gender cases, they agreed 90% of the time because they both knew what it was like to be a woman. And I think that fundamentally informed both of their jurisprudence. Afterwards, when Justice O'Connor left, Justice Ginsburg really felt differently, and a couple of things happened. One was she had spent her life being a first, and she hated it. She hated having to explain to Erwin Griswold why she was taking a spot reserved for a man at Harvard. She hated having to get up in front of her classes at Harvard and be the woman and give the woman's point of view. And I think that O'Connor had done that work for her at the Supreme Court. O'Connor had been the first, and Ginsburg always felt that she benefited because by the time she came on, all that spade work of being the first was done. When O'Connor left, she became the only. And I should just note parenthetically, because I think there's a lot of talk now about why she didn't retire when she could have. And one of the things I absolutely know to be true is that she felt that O'Connor was pushed off the bench. She felt that Sandra Day O'Connor left before she was ready because Chief Justice Rehnquist wouldn't step down when he had thyroid cancer, and O'Connor left one term before she wanted to take care of her husband, John, who was extremely ill. If Rehnquist hadn't said, "No, you leave, I'll leave next year," O'Connor would have ended up staying because by that next year, John O'Connor was so sick he had to be institutionalized. And she might have been on the bench for many more years. You'll remember O'Connor said years later, "My entire legacy has been dismantled," because she was replaced by Justice Alito. And I think that for Ginsburg, that was a really cautionary story about a woman being forced or bullied off the bench by a man before she was ready. And right or wrong, she took it as a feminist story. And she was very, very disinclined when the sort of legal academy started saying to her in 2010, 2011, 2012, "Get off the court so Obama can replace you." She saw it as bullying and she wouldn't leave. But I think that what I really want to say about the ways in which she changed is that it wasn't white-hot anger. Even when she was furious, even writing Shelby County, even writing Lily Ledbetter, it was not white-hot rage the way Rebecca Traister describes it in her book about anger. It was always, always a very, very different, for her, but not angry style of lawyering. I think what she gave up on was trying to persuade her colleagues. I think what she didn't give up on was trying to persuade young women. And to my mind, that was the thing that was transformed. And it became this perfect feedback loop because that was the time when she becomes the notorious RBG and young women stand in line for hours to get a selfie with her. So my own sense of the matter is that she gave up on trying to persuade, not altogether, but I think the court changed. And in her view, the court became the young women of America who she was going to empower to change the world. And that's who she started writing for. And by the way, that's the era where her writing changes altogether. She's no longer quoting other people. She's now writing from her own voice. She's channeling the women she knew. She is writing as Lily Ledbetter, finding out that she faced a grievous pay disparity. She's writing as the women of Walmart who are being treated like meat by their coworkers. And all of that comes out, not in anger, I think, but in this transformational new voice. And one of the hallmarks, I think, as a court watcher of this change, this shift, where she really does find her own voice and stop, I think, writing as a kindergarten teacher and starts writing maybe as a 1L professor, is in the Savannah Redding search case. And this is the case of the 14-year-old girl who's strip searched at her high school without her permission, without any consent from her parents, because the school believes that she's running some massive contraband ibuprofen ring. And so they strip search Savannah Redding, and she sues the school. And at oral argument, again, Sandra Day O'Connor is gone, RBG is the only. And the men at oral argument, I can only describe it, the women in the room were gasping. It was like a scene out of Porky's or Meatballs. It was the strangest thing to see the male justices kind of get silly, kind of giggling about the strip search and like, did they strip search her from the inside out or the outside in? And then Justice Breyer made some unfortunate joke about people sticking underwear or stuff in his underwear when he was at gym class, and wasn't this like that? And how different is it to be strip searched by the school because you're changing for PE anyway? And you could just see, it was the only time I ever saw Justice Ginsburg visibly angry listening to this. And she just put a stop to it. She said, it's nothing like that. And then she did something I'd never seen her do before or after, gave an interview to Joan Biskupik at USA Today at the time, just saying, I don't get it. They don't have any idea what it's like to be a 14-year-old girl subject to a strip search at your school. And then she just plain said, there need to be more women on this court because they don't know what they're talking about. And interestingly, I will say that one time that I saw her get viscerally angry, the vote flipped entirely in that case. We walked out of argument thinking for sure the school district would win by probably like a 6-3, 7-2 margin. Savannah Redding ended up winning that case, I think in part because she called out the men on the bench. But that was really a time where I said to myself, something's different. Something's changed for her. She's not the kindergarten teacher, the white gloved supplicant anymore. She is stepping into some different position at the court. And that really is around the time that she started assigning herself to write opinions and dissents and started really writing from a place that was authentically her. So I guess that's my question for you, as I'm trying, as I commemorate her and explain her, to thread this line between somebody who was a transformational feminist and somebody who really lived all the values that my grandmother lived, about being nice and being pretty and being well put together and having your shoes match your bag and making sure that you don't offend, that you don't raise the temperature, and making sure that you never burn a bridge with somebody who could be an ally. And again, I think that her infinite patience for people sometimes drove me crazy. Her infinite patience for Chief Justice Rehnquist, who she adored when I thought that sometimes he was doing shocking things. Her deep, deep, deep regard for Anthony Kennedy, even after he wrote a majority opinion in a partial birth abortion case that she found abhorrent. She just kept going back to them, just kept saying, I'm going to win you round. I'm going to pick off this vote this time. And never, ever, I think, wrote a word in anger or a word to humiliate someone. And one of the things she said when I interviewed her was that her fondest memory at law school was of a professor she had who never belittled anybody, never used the Socratic method to shame or besmirch or in some way make a student feel small, but that he always reframed the question to make the student look smart. And I thought to myself, my God, on the one hand, she is just a sweet old Jewish lady. And on the other hand, she is, without a doubt, the most effective advocate in a time where no one else has the patience to do that slow brickwork of bringing people around. And so I don't think that the story we're telling right now is quite right. I don't think that the law works as an exercise of raw power. I don't think the law works if you give up on the possibility, at least, of persuasion, the possibility, at least, of listening and trying to understand what your adversary is saying. And I for sure do not think that the law can function if you are going to have repeat interactions with the same players over and over again, and you take a torch to them on the first day. I always remember one of the stories that Justice Ginsburg told very frequently is that the most important secret to a good marriage was advice that her mother-in-law gave her when she married Marty. And the advice was always be a little bit deaf. And there was nothing, even in January, wrong with Justice Ginsburg's hearing. But she managed somehow to be a little bit deaf, as she said, to some of the real ugliness, to the unseemliness going on around her. And she always, I think, managed in the most lawyerly fashion to change the subject back to the law. And I think I want to end by just saying that's why I think this moment is just doubly tragic. Not just that we have lost this woman who, even though she did it in lacy white gloves and sensible brooches, did the absolute lawyerly work of changing the world and doing it not through anger, through rage, through fury, not with her body, which was about this big, but with the absolute core values that the law can change things for everyone, and that we do that with civility and comedy and decorum. And I think the utter secondary tragedy here is that her death was completely overshadowed within an hour by all of those things she didn't prize: ugliness, bad faith, mistrust, lack of truth. And I feel that she would weep. She would weep for both sides and for what we are losing. I think I said in the podcast that Melissa's quoting, before our very eyes, we are losing some of these values. And I wish desperately that we could at least honor her by returning not to the iconic coffee mug feminist we wanted her to be, but returning, I think, to the careful, scrupulous, count to 10 before you say something dumb, oh, don't say it at all, lawyer that she really was. So I want to thank you for spending this time with me. I'm happy if people want to be angry to just talk about anger. But for me, I think the real grief of this moment is that we have lost the model of something that I think we all need much more of in the world. So thank you very much. I'm going to mute myself and turn it back to Melissa to wrangle the Q&A. You're muted, I think.
Do you hear me now? Okay, back on. So thank you so much, Dahlia, for your insight. We really appreciate you sharing those stories and experience with us in such a timely fashion here that we are. So we had a few questions that we received some in advance and also as you were speaking. So the first is allegations surfaced last week, which seems like a long time ago now, that female detainees in a ICE facility in Georgia are being given forced hysterectomies without their consent. You've written about America's history of forced sterilization directed most often at women of color, a history that may surprise many individuals. I know it surprises many individuals that I speak to. Can you speak a little bit about that and your views on the recent allegations and kind of some of the historical context of some of those incidents as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated legal story. It's also a really complicated journalistic story. And I think one of the things I wrote about was, and it maybe goes to my general theme this evening, the sort of very overheated allegations that got plastered under a headline. And I actually wrote to Dan Abrams, whose website the original allegations went up on, because I think he used the phrase medical experimentation in the very first headline. And I think whatever the allegations were, and we can talk about, what surfaced later over the week, I don't think anything is served by clickbaity headlines suggesting that this was, comparable, as they were implying, to what Mengele was doing at the camps. So I think that part of the reason that story right out the chute was troubling to me is that the allegations on their own merits were horrifying. And we didn't need, I think, to make comparisons to, medical experiments in the Holocaust. We did that to get eyeballs and to get clicks. And I could talk for hours. We can talk more about sort of the really bad ways that legal journalism is falling prey to, the tics and the foibles of all journalism. But I think bad, misleading, clickbaity headlines do not serve anyone, including those women, and do not serve the story. So that's my sort of journalistic view of how that went wrong. But I think you're quite right. As the initial complaint, there was a nurse who was alleging that this had happened, but there was nobody on the record willing to participate in the claim who had suffered a hysterectomy themselves. As the week progressed, two women did come forward, and it is fairly clear that women were having, without their consent, procedures that rendered them infertile. And the truly horrifying story was that one of them was almost deported as that story was surfacing, and but for congressional intercession would have been on a plane. And that's, an abuse of power, an abusive process that is beyond the scope of anything, it's so unconscionable. But I think in some ways we have a whistleblower complaint and we have an inspector general, and preferably I would hope that the IG's office will now figure out what was happening. But as to the merits of the question, Melissa, there is no doubt that this country has a long and horrifying history of what really is, in some cases, medical experimentation. And the entire eugenics movement that was blessed by Oliver Wendell Holmes in the Supreme Court in Buck versus Bell was, in fact, some of that serves the eugenic hysterectomies that were being performed serves as a model for the Nazis who think this is a good idea. That originated here in this country. The case that I described that Melissa's referencing was a case that was utterly buried in California, where a hospital in California was without patients' knowledge or consent performing sterilizations routinely. And the class action that surfaced was eventually, in an unpublished opinion, dismissed. And none of us would have known that history but for intrepid filmmakers and advocates who explained that this was not happening, this was happening in the 1970s. This wasn't the 1950s. And the really essential part of the story, Melissa, that I also think got lost, that I want to re-up here, is that without a doubt, both in the California case that I described and in the case we learned of last week, the problem is also one of translation, that there are language barriers. What they were doing in California was sterilizing women without explaining to them in their language, their first language, what was happening. And that seems to be at least a part of the complaint of what we're seeing, is it's just a matter of getting a translator in some of these cases and explaining to people in their native tongue what it is that they have. And so I think, again, this goes to so much of what I want to celebrate in Justice Ginsburg is that tiny act of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, the tiny imaginative act of saying, how hard would it be to explain to this person what it is that I'm doing before I do it? And that was, I think, the original sin of what we saw in the California litigation. I suspect that's going to prove to be a huge part of the story when we learn more about these ICE sterilizations.
Thank you, Dahlia. So you talk about kind of interesting headlines and a little bit of our politics of the day. Lots of questions, perhaps not surprisingly, about the presidential election. And as we're in an election year in a couple of weeks, not too far out, you've written extensively, and I'm kind of putting together some of the questions that different folks have sent in here. But you've written that this upcoming election will raise a host of existential questions that go far beyond who will win. Instead, this election is about the future of the American experiment with democracy itself. So if you can opine a little bit or kind of explain a little bit more your thinking on that. And also kind of a twofer on this one, can you share your thoughts on how the impact this election will have on women, but also conversely, what impact women can have on this election?
Yeah, now I feel like I'm being scolded for my clickbaity headlines, but I actually think that wasn't just my headlines, right? That was, I mean, I think that I have been, and it's actually a fascinating, in its own terms, journalistic problem. I've been so worried about what is going to happen in this election, in part because right before COVID, I did a big 5-part series with Rick Hasson at UC Irvine, and sort of really, this was COVID and mail-in voting, but just sort of walk through, the series was cheerfully named Election Meltdown, and walk through what could go wrong. And even before we sort of got to the Wisconsin primary in April and saw what happened when you go from 185 polling places to 5 in Milwaukee, it was very clear to me even then that this was going to be a fight to the teeth between sort of efforts at voter suppression on the one hand, foreign election interference, which we knew happened before and which we know is still happening, and then just voters, my real concern, and this was a concern we talked about actually in the series with historian Carol Anderson, about what do you do about voter confidence? If you over and over and over again say that the election is rigged, the election is going to be stolen, all you are doing is contributing to a narrative that allows voters to say, you know what, I don't want to stand out in the cold for 6 hours if my vote is meaningless. And so I think the paradox that I was always on, threaded through the series, and then really acutely as I've written about the election this summer, is how do I tell people what's going wrong, honestly and realistically, without persuading them that the whole damn thing is broken and they should just move to Switzerland. And so what I've tried to do, and I don't know how well I've succeeded, is to just be really open about the places that I think are the cracks and the fissures, in the hopes that things can get repaired. And so again, I think my headlines and some of my pieces have been fairly apocalyptic. I wrote a piece in The Prospect in the UK in which I likened the current system in which nobody trusts the other side anymore to that. You remember the Zen story about the Zen master who takes the bowl and smashes it because it's already broken anyway? And I sort of said, our trust in each other is broken anyway. And Larry Tribe at Harvard wrote a blistering takedown saying that I was too pessimistic. So it's entirely possible that I'm too pessimistic. I mean, just as to the question itself, Melissa, there are currently 300 lawsuits, election-related lawsuits. That's a lot. That's a new record. 43 states, including D.C. and Puerto Rico, now are in the midst of an election lawsuit. If you've been following what's happening in Nevada, in Pennsylvania, what's happening with challenges to mail-in voting on the one hand, or attempts, I think, that in states that want to expand the franchise, attempts to, put in more polling places, putting more mailboxes, curbside voting, curbside registration. So there's this tension, this always push me, pull you between one side wanting to expand the franchise, especially in COVID, the other side wanting to contract it. And I think that the really new development, in addition to COVID, and in addition to whatever's happened at the post office over the course of the summer, is that we have, a nominee and his attorney general affirmatively saying the election is already stolen. And if I lose, it will be because it was rigged. And people should vote twice, and people should go to their polling places and intimidate voters. Like the aggressive leaning into the story that you cannot trust the other side is really new. And if you look at, Jeff Toobin has a great piece that I would commend to you in this week's New Yorker, but if you look at his piece, he sort of starts and ends with Bush v. Gore. And we all knew that whoever was declared the winner in 2000 would be the winner, and that the loser would concede and walk away. He has no confidence, nor do I, that that is necessarily the case. And I think what's really become alarming is hearing even Joe Biden say things like, well, I'm not going to concede on the first night because, we did that in 2000 and look where that. So both sides, I think, have this double incentive not to cave, not to look weak, not to get rolled. And then you're just looking at Brooks Brothers riots, in 100 places all over the country, which is, if you took anything from what I said about RBG, just not what lawyers are supposed to be doing. So that's what worries me a little. Just as to women, I think the decision to replace Justice Ginsburg has viscerally, I think, energized women. Even, I would say, pre-Justice Ginsburg's death, polling was suggesting that people, but specifically women, were prioritizing the court as a voting issue, and that has not historically been the case. And partly, I think that was post-Kavanaugh, and partly, I think that is the sense that Roe is kind of hanging by a thread after June Medical. And so I think that women were already very energized around justice in the court and also around Black Lives Matter. And I think that it will be, I think it sort of remains to be seen, but I think that the differential in Donald Trump's polling numbers between men and women is clearly one of the stories of this election. And I guess I would just end by saying, when women ask me what women should be doing, I really do totemically say, what would Ruth Bader Ginsburg do? And the answer is use your voice. We have huge voices, huge platforms, huge networks. And if we're not using our power right now to have a plan, to get out to vote, make sure our moms have a plan, make sure our cousins have plans, drive people, all the things that women are super good at, right? This is when the Women's March organizers were first organizing, and they said, how are you doing all this? How is it that women are leading the move to, for instance, call congressmen and preserve the ACA in 2017? And all the women I talked to were like, man, this is what I'm just really good at, is sitting in my car, barking into my speakerphone with the kids in the back seat. Like, this is how we live our lives. And we're great at organizing. And so I think it's just redeploying, repurposing the skills that we already have and recognizing that we nobody's going to save us. We got to save us.
So I think we have time for one more question. And this is, again, kind of combining a few here. Any of you can comment, just can you give your thoughts on either some of the most notable cases of this year, either from the term that just ended or kind of the term that we're heading into, and kind of things to watch from your perspective?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I sort of filibustered. We should have left more time for questions. I will try to be brief. Maybe we can take one more. But I would really say this was, I think, the most fascinating term I've ever watched, and bracket the fact that we had, real-time audio oral argument, which is, I think, a game changer, and I hope stays forever. But I think even beside that, clearly the most interesting story is John Roberts flipping in DACA, Neil Gorsuch flipping in Title VII, and John Roberts doing something that I don't want to call flipping in June Medical. And June Medical was, the big ticket. Really, were we going to drive a stake through the heart of Roe? I will say, just on that last point, I thought the most fascinating sort of internecine warfare that broke out among journalists and Supreme Court reporters was that the day June Medical came down and John Roberts sort of wrote that line, I thought whole women's health was wrongly decided then. I still think it's wrongly decided, but stare decisis, it's for dinner. And, I'm not going to overrule willy-nilly a case we decided 4 years ago. Every woman lawyer I knew reacted by saying, oh my God, this is not a win. He's not reaffirming whole women's health. We're in big trouble. He's just saying, bring me a better case. And so Melissa Murray wrote the piece, and Leah Lippman wrote the piece, and Linda Greenhouse wrote the piece, and Dahlia Lithwick wrote the piece. All of us, Reva Siegel, saying, this is terrible. Like, he did not just bolster Roe. In fact, he took us back to the Casey standard and weakened the standard in whole women's health that Justice Breyer had put into place. And Jeff Toobin wrote the piece, and Larry Tribe wrote the piece, and every male journalist wrote the piece that was like, take the win. Why are you whining? This was a great day for women. And I thought it's just another one of those moments, those sort of Savannah Redding moments where women journalists and men journalists read that case utterly differently. Just going into this term, I think everybody knows the court's going to be deciding the Affordable Care Act a week after the election, conveniently, so it's not an election issue, and that's hugely consequential. And Fulton, which is the sort of follow-on to the line of objector cases, which is just a Philadelphia that won't use taxpayer funds for foster care entities that discriminate against gay families. And that really is, I think, the thin edge of the wedge, these sort of religious liberty challenges to civil rights legislation. And so that, I think, is going to be interesting. But for sure, the most interesting thing is that any one of those 300-some lawsuits I described may well end up at the Supreme Court. They're already fast-tracking the census litigation to the Supreme Court, and we could have a 4-4 decision in a Bush v. Gore that is something that would drive me right directly into the vodka bottle.
Hopefully still with some calm and not too angry, so we can figure out next steps. I think we have time for one last question that I'll squeeze in here. From the audience. It says, given how many excellent articles you've written, the people you've interviewed throughout your career, it might be a difficult question to answer, but if you could choose, what piece did you write stands out as being especially meaningful to you? What did you learn from writing that piece, or perhaps through working on the piece, you interviewed a person who was particularly impactful on your career as a woman in the legal industry?
Could we add 20 minutes to the clock, Melissa? I will go quick and say, it's a very hard question, and it's a profound question. I actually think, believe it or not, I wrote a piece last autumn explaining why I had not been back to the Supreme Court since the Kavanaugh hearings. And it was complicated in part because for a year after the Kavanaugh hearings, I just pretended I was sick all the time. And I would just be like, I can't make it today. And so I finally had to just confess that I could not haul my body back into the building, having, I should note, sat, in that room when Dr. Blasey Ford was testifying, when Kavanaugh was testifying. I was like one of just a tiny number of reporters sitting at the press table, and I just couldn't do it. And I think it was the hardest thing I've ever written. It was incredibly fraught writing it. I don't ever want the story to be about me, and so I didn't like writing about myself. But I was trying to just be candid with my readers about why I couldn't enter the building. And I will just say the two funny outcomes of that piece were the number of law professors who wrote to me saying, thank you. I have stopped teaching con law since the Kavanaugh hearings, and you have reaffirmed why. And I was like, no, you can't stop teaching con law. Like, what I did was for me, but like just really shocking number of people who took that Kavanaugh hearing as like the court's broken and I will no longer distinguish it by saying that this is constitutional law. And I was really, really in pain when I got that response, because I thought and I can end with this, but I think these questions of complicity and covering And how do you stay within an institution when you think it is finally and fundamentally broken are the existential questions of this age, and in a million different iterations. And for me, having wrestled with that question and said, I can't sit here and pretend like everything's okay. I understand that he's in a black robe now, but I don't think there was an investigation. Those questions of complicity, I think, are so personal and so go to the core of who we are. And I'm not sure I would write that piece again. And I'm not sure that I could ever walk into the building again. So I think probably that's my answer. I don't have a sort of satisfying bow on top what I learned from it. But what I learned is, I think, from the feedback in that particular case, everybody is struggling with these same questions of being part of a machinery that feels like it's bending under something huge, and how long you stay on. So I just want to say thank you. This has been, like I said, I really wish we were together, but it's been really, really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. I greatly appreciate your thoughts and insight. Sorry we can't do it in person, but I'm very happy for us and all of our viewers that we were able to do this. Thank you again, and have a good evening to you and to all watching. Thank you.